Now it's my pleasure to introduce our lunch speaker, James K. Galbraith, Jamie Galbraith. Again, everyone is very familiar with his accomplishments and his writings, so I'm just going to highlight what I consider to be key points that maybe the people are not as familiar with. And of course, he's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin and director of the University of Texas Inequality Project, and also senior scholar at the Levy Institute. But I think it's important to note that in the 1980s, he was executive director of the Joint Economic Committee at U.S. Congress. So I think, you know, that kind of real-world experience before one settles in academia is unusual, and we'd like to see more of that. And then also in the 90s, 93 to 97, served as chief technical advisor to China's State Planning Commission for Macroeconomic Reform, and then in 2015 served as an informal counselor to the Greek Minister of Finance. In terms of many books you're familiar with, but the most recent, he's got 2 books this year. Welcome to the Poisoned Chalice, The Destruction of Greece and the Future of Europe. That's Yale University Press, 2016. And Inequality, What Everyone Needs to Know, Oxford University Press. And then in 2014, The End of Normal, The Great Crisis and the Future of Growth. The one other thing I'd like to mention is that in addition to his degrees from Harvard and Yale, that Jamie was a Marshall Scholar at King's College, Cambridge, where his biggest influence was Nicholas Caldor. So please join me in a warm welcome to Jamie Galbraith.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and Matt, thank you for that précis of my career, including many things that I had myself forgotten. But as you may have noticed, it has a pattern which I highly recommend to those of you who are at the start of your professional careers, and that is that you should begin in a senior policy position at a moment of economic crisis and transformation, and that's very good preparation for a entry into academic life as a policy essayist and a slow evolution toward the writing of technical papers for refereed journals. But actually, basically, it's like one of those novels where time runs backwards, and it's much less stressful than doing it the other way around, when you actually have to pass through professional peer review before you get anywhere. The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Magnet and authority, you hear voices in the air. I'm going to spare you the full quotation. I, however, cite it for a reason, and that is that among the brand name economists of the day, The debate is over a phrase that goes back to Keynes's era, or just after, the phrase being secular stagnation. This is defined by Larry Summers as the condition of a, quote, low real neutral rate of interest, or in Fed speak, a low or starved world, which is said to mean that the interest rate is neither expansionary nor contractionary in its effect on the state of aggregate demand, is close to zero. Investigating this is an interesting exercise in the exploration of the haunted house of the history of economic thought. One finds the ghost of Luc Bixel paired with that of Dennis Robertson, the doctrine of a natural rate of interest commingled with the theory of vulnerable funds. In a recent paper from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, which was cited by Summers as thoughtful, an economist named John Williams gave the, quote, underlying determinants of the neutral or natural rate as, quote, the global supply and demand for funds, including shifting demographics, lower trend productivity and economic growth, emerging markets seeking large reserves of safe assets, and a more general global savings glut. In other words, it's a grab bag, based on reports from the Council of Economic Advisors, the International Monetary Fund, and leading lights of MIT and elsewhere. That report from the Council is, by at least in part, my 1974-75 King's College contemporary Maurice Obstfeld. And it is as remarkable a document as an economist might hope to find on White House letterhead. Consider this passage. The Ramsey Model generates a fundamental link between per capita consumption growth, the real interest rate, and the growth rate of the economy. The model is based on the dynamic saving and investment decisions of a hypothetical, infinitely lived representative household. Reference to the model detailed in an appendix is omitted here. In this setup, the household chooses an optimal saving investment plan to maximize the present value of utility from current and future consumption. We begin with the simplest version of the model, which assumes that the household has perfect foresight about the future. What else it would have perfect sort of foresight about, it's not entirely clear. Later discussion will take uncertainty into account. I hope that reassures you. As Bill Clinton used to say what? This is actually a government view? Early on, the paper gives a simplified version. Quote, a high return on investment should trigger a reallocation of resources from consumption toward capital accumulation, driving down the marginal product of capital and the real interest rate over time. Similarly, a low return on investment should induce consumers to increase current consumption and reduce capital investment, eventually driving up the real interest rate. Such economic forces should limit extremely high or extremely low real interest rates and work to push the rate back to intermediate levels. The reference to the marginal product of capital raises the specter of capital theory, which was in fact a hot topic at Cambridge in 1975, although it seems that Morey missed that. As we know from Sraffa and as Samuelson had already conceded in 1966, a more capital-intensive technique is not necessarily the more profitable at a low rate of interest, and an increase in capital accumulation does not necessarily lead to a lower rate of profit or of interest. The two are not necessarily conflated. That point was made eloquently and was talked to others yesterday. Nor to a reduction in later capital investment, and so a rise in the future rate of interest. There is no Bixel-Ramsey natural rate. Other references to emerging markets and savings gluts evoke the loanable funds doctrine, global scale, or as the paper says, the interest rate settles at the level that equates the supply of saving with the demand for investment. Our fellow kinsman, John Maynard Keynes, is not cited. Although, so far as I can recall, Keynes did write a book with the word interest in the title, in which he states of the classical theory that his own analysis, quote, will have made it plain that this account of the matter must be erroneous. Keynes's theory of interest does not rest on the capital stock or any marginal productivity thereof. There is no market for financial capital that equates saving and investment at the interest rate price of capital services. Quote, the rate of interest is not the price which brings into equilibrium the demand for resources to invest with the readiness to abstain from consumption. It is the price which equilibrates the desire to hold wealth in the form of cash with the available quantity of cash. That was Keynes's view in Keynes's day, and at that time there was an apparent definiteness to the available quantity of cash, which I think is a proposition about which one can be reasonably skeptical in the age of insured electronic bank balances, which perhaps the available liquidity is for practical purposes unlimited. So instead of an interest rate determined by the supply and demand for cash, there's an administered cost of funds, the bank rate, the federal funds rate, at a markup covering bankers' costs, alleged risk, and what the market will bear. The interest rate appears unaffected by shifts in the desire for liquidity as a practical matter. In the global financial market that now exists, to the extent that such shifts affect any variable, it's the exchange rate, not the interest rate. That the dollar cost of funds to banks is now a policy, that this is an administered price set once every 6 weeks by the Federal Open Market Committee, is apparently not to be admitted in a White House paper. But it is the basis of Summers' quote, neutral, short-term, or policy-driven interest rate, which appears to be effectively the shiftable level of a horizontal LM curve set so as to leave the income growth at trend. But this construction, whatever its merit as a description of the effects of Fed policy, has consequences for long-term rates. As even the White House admits, long rates are a function in part, and I would say in large part, of the expected sequence of short rates. And so the prevalence of low short rates, as the prevalence of low short rates became the norm, through the persistence of policy over time, low risk long rates followed them down. In this light, the ineffectiveness of a low cost of funds as a macro policy should be no surprise. The fear of risk has risen, the desire to borrow, including to invest, except perhaps in cheap imported electronics, has declined. Low realized rates of growth of productivity and high liquidity are effects, not causes. So too is a high markup on the slim volume of new loans. So too is a proliferation of intermediaries who obscure who exactly is bearing the risk. Against these forces, low short rates are weak too. And now, if short rates are ever raised even a bit, remembering that a rise from 25 to 50 basis points is a doubling, the risk-adjusted yield curve flattens further and soon inverts somewhere, and hell breaks loose. Initially, this may be in emerging markets via hot money capital flows and plunging exchange rates. I spoke yesterday about the effect of that on economic inequality, which is very pronounced and highly visible in the economies of countries all across the globe. But ultimately, the effects will be felt in domestic finance. The predictable and observable result is a lot of talk about raising rates, but remarkably little action. Whether this is a new form of the classic stop-go problem or a calculated effort to steepen the yield curve ex ante is, I think, a bit hard to say. A byproduct in either case is an appearance of uncertainty and indecision, notwithstanding that it occurs, and this is, I think, an irony of a process that I was involved in for many years, which was the process of oversight and accountability of the Federal Reserve, that it occurs in what is by historical standards an admirably transparent and remarkably rational central bank in the sense of attempting at least to explain its actions in the light of a particular theory of how the world and financial markets work. The problem is that that theory, being the one I described or some relevant variation of it, is not a theory that bears any actual relationship to the way things actually work. Uncertainty over the future course of interest rates is the foundation of liquidity preference. It is the reason why an otherwise risk-free long-term bond might suffer a capital loss if sold before maturity. So by fostering this uncertainty, the central bank increases liquidity preference and reduces the willingness of wealth holders to lend at long term. Hence the rush to T-bills and the rise of the dollar whenever Mr. Stanley Fischer drops one of his heavy hints. Secular stagnation, then, is not the product of some mysterious global forces, savings sloshing around in excess of investment, and demographic changes, and productivity slowdowns, and the mysterious workings of technology. It is rather iatrogenic. In the mainstream dispensation, the low R star has been recast as a pre-Keynesian concept, driven by fundamentals such as demography and technology, against which, not entirely coherently, a raft of mainstream economists propose what they call the Keynesian remedy, deficit spending. And in my text, after hearing Bill Mitchell last night, I put that in quotation marks. I see he nods his approval, by government. Especially they favor loan finance public investment programs, which are said to be productive. And that's an interesting word. It's productive in the sense advanced by Adam Smith at the outset of modern classical political economy. Beyond this, the new dealers do not feel the need to specify in close detail what spending should be for. It suffices to argue over guidelines, timely, targeted, and temporary, as against perhaps substantial, strategic, and sustained, as they used to say back in 2009. This overlooks the fact that the original New Deal had large elements of forestry, conservation, projects for writers and artists and photographers, and other things that would not be considered productive at all by these lines. And it also had almost nothing by way of macroeconomic forecasts. I recently drafted for some Italian colleagues, actually, a preface for a new edition of Franklin Roosevelt's 1933 book, Looking Forward, his blueprint for the New Deal. I had not read it before. And the striking thing about this is precisely that it captures and expresses FDR's practical frame of mind, which was focused on specific problems, things he learned about as governor of New York, things that had impinged on his attention as the Depression deepened at the national scale. Problems such as farming and town management, and taxation and power and transport and water and banks. And not at all on the abstract frameworks of economic macro management, which did not yet exist at that time. It's obvious that, however, that FDR was focused on spending for purposes and for the good that could be done by specific acts of public expenditure, public administration reform. If he had had economists around to tell him all about potential output, mean reversion, and that his central bank was in a low R-starred world, he would never have gotten anywhere. But I digress. To get back to mad people in authority, it does seem that both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump have absorbed up to a point the implications of this talk of secular stagnation. They have heard the voices in the air. So we have Trump, as far as he's proposing anything, appears to be proposing a combination of tax cuts and infrastructure spending. Deficits be damned, blessing for that. And Clinton proposing the infrastructure without the tax cut, indeed with tax increases on the wealthy, within the framework of fiscal responsibility that is the mantra of her economists and her donors. The difference is partly one of constituencies, but it's also partly one of starting point. The Trump message is that everything has gone to hell and must be fixed. The Clinton message is that steady progress since 2009 must be sustained. One might take this as a hopeful sign, and perhaps to a degree it is. Both candidates apparently favor a large-scale public investment program, even though it's unlikely that either could get one enacted. Neither speaks of inflation. We seem far from the Phillips curve of the 1960s, the stagflation of the 1970s, the do-nothing new classical consensus of the 1980s, or the fraudulent social security scares of the 1990s, although I believe the latter may not lurk too far below the surface of the present political discourse. And yet I cannot shake a feeling of unease that by positing the problem to have a purely financial basis relating largely to the interest rate and its discontents, that we are slipping too easily into a different form of complacency, in which we urge vast and easy solution without taking full stock of our condition. And this is a formula that it seems to me if we pursue it, and we as speak of this community here, would almost surely end in tears. So I want to turn now to a theme that I spoke about 2 years ago and that I wrote about in a book that came out in 2014 called The End of Normal, in which part of what I was attempting to do was to appeal to the post-Keynesian community to take a closer account of the concerns that institutional economists be prone to raise about the conditions that we face now and how they differ from the conditions of the world at large faced in, say, the 1930s. To ask the question, is it possible that we stand today, from where we stand today, to reignite the flames of economic growth that we enjoyed over the post-war period? And would it be desirable to do this if it could be done? My answer to this question is no. And that is true notwithstanding complete agreement that if there were no material, technological, or institutional obstacles, fiscal expansion would be the way to proceed and would be effective under present conditions. But it seems to me that the fact is that material, technical, and institutional obstacles do exist. And as an institutionalist, in addition to being a Keynesian, I feel duty-bound to point these out and to insist that they should be taken into account. The first of these is the geophysical realities, and specifically with respect to the supply of the fundamental commodities that power the system, in particular, energy. We've had, since 1970, peak conventional oil in the lower 48 of the United States. We are experiencing, or shortly will experience, very large, likely peak conventional oil at the global scale, with a time-limited but uncertain and perhaps already declining reprieve in the form of tight oil and natural gas from shale formations, and combined with the financialization of energy markets, which generate what I called in The End of Normal the choke tank effect. That is to say, the speculative run-up of the prices of these commodities, which has an arresting effect on the progress of effective demand in the period of growth, followed by a massive downswing, which has an effect on the expected profitability of investment, both in energy development and in alternatives. We are kidding ourselves, it seems to me, if we believe that economic growth can be fully divorced from energy usage and achieved irrespective of the costs of acquiring basic resources. If you haven't noticed, the military cost of extracting resources from countries where they remain, for now, available at relatively low engineering costs is also extremely high. And that particular tool is, let's say, of exceptionally limited effectiveness. There is also, of course, the overriding problem of the resulting greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. One way forward is to ramp up the harvest of solar power. recognizing that this must mean foregoing available fossil fuel options and accepting a diversion of resources away from current consumption. In that case, it follows that the living standards we can support in comfort under sustainable energy will necessarily be less than otherwise. There's no way of making that. But by softening the peak, by stretching it out over time, we can lessen the shock of the decline and give ourselves more time to make the transition to the extent that it can be made, and to figure out ways of living well within the energy that we can sustain. Second issue relates to technology. The particular character of technological change that we have been experiencing, which has thrown up a statistical puzzle that our mainstream economist colleagues have been puzzling over prominently in recent last several years. And that is that high rates of apparent technical transformation all around us in the form of the digital revolution appear alongside slow rates of measured productivity. I want to suggest that perhaps it's not such a puzzle, that the problem has been the neoclassical lens through which it is viewed. It's not such a puzzle to the extent that A, the price of investment goods after adjustment for their improving quality has fallen, while B, the proportion imported has gone up. In those circumstances, investment in a given dollar volume will not generate so much new output in the statistical record, or there will be less of it. And the growth of measured output over labor input will be lower, even though the new technologies may also displace quite a lot of labor. But the problem for us is not this artifact of low measured productivity growth, but the actual fact of lost jobs, of underemployment, and a population short of services that it requires. And here again, I'll come back to something that Bill said last night when we talked about the need for imagination to deal with this problem. Precisely what's needed, to think about what it is that people can do and get them doing it under institutional frameworks that make it possible for this to be done. Is the issue that we face, not whether the resulting rate of productivity growth achieves some benchmark in the statistical record. It requires us, in other words, to identify specific needs and to meet them with appropriate institutions. The utility and the usefulness of jobs that meet needs will not be measured by their contribution to GDP or to productivity growth, nor to private profits. And I think I recognize that this is a point that's been made by Robert Skidelsky as well. And in these respects, the entire relationship between economic statistics and welfare needs an overhaul. The measure is whether we can fund, supervise, and sustain useful employment, meeting vital goals. Institutions that do this generally may not be the kind normally created in the pursuit of private profits. Find out other ways of doing it. We have alternative institutions. The question is the proportions in the society that we need to build will be quite different from the ones today. And the third issue that I keep coming back to is the question of banks. You can't expect the financial sector as it is to deliver public purpose. It's not designed for that purpose, it's not staffed for that purpose, and it's not regulated effectively for that purpose. It did at one point deliver a certain model of growth, a model of growth based upon the great rapid expansion of credit, permissive expansion of credit, followed by bust, by creation of debt, followed by dispossession. That model of growth broke down 9 years ago. Or if you prefer, you can argue that the last moderately legitimate credit-fueled business boom ended 16 years ago, the end of the top-down boom in the year 2000. And while there always will be people who feel obliged to borrow, a new generation of suckers will arise, as a growth model, even the boom and bust isn't viable anymore. The sooner we recognize this, the better. What should be done about the banks? This is a question to which I don't have a good answer. My fear is that this may be a problem without a viable solution. These are institutions with high fixed costs, with technologies and transnational legal structures that are designed to facilitate tax evasion and regulatory arbitrage, and which face very limited prospects for sustained profitability in activities that correspond to social need. Their entire structure, in a word, isn't viable in a world of slow growth. except by fostering very short-lived booms, of which the shale rush was perhaps the most recent example, again followed by busts and bailouts. If going forward the world is going to generate only a reduced volume of total private profit, it may soon be necessary to face the fact that the financial sector as a whole is a luxury we cannot afford. Here's the net of these factors. First, energy markets and climate constraints place implacable limits on the effectiveness of demand expansion, which will be expressed as induced shocks to the price of energy in the best case and ultimate unsustainability in the worst. Second, the evolution of technological change limits the effect of demand stimulus on measured growth, productivity, and private profits, hence on the inducement to invest. Third, the dysfunction of the financial sector, combined with the continuing desire to deleverage, limits the multiplier effect and the stability of any expansion. These problems are not to be cured in any simple way. They require an economic strategy that is closely tailored to actual social needs and at the same time fully conscious of the limits of what can be achieved. On the way up here on Thursday, I listened to the radio, including an hour-long program, the Diane Green Show, discussing the recent report of the Census Bureau, income and poverty in the United States in the last year, 2014-2015. And it was a remarkable exercise in the celebration of apparent improvement in social conditions, which is being taken by a great many people, including in the campaign circles and official circles, as a vindication of the strategy of steady, slow and steady expansion over the last 7 years, and a sign that the basic underlying problems of the American economy have been cured, so perhaps the concerns that have just been raised are excessive. But does this news lay these concerns to rest? I would say it doesn't. And I'll give you a very specific reason for that. It appears that the gains which lowered the poverty rate and raised the median and raised incomes, particularly in the lower part of the spectrum, were based largely on gains of hours rather than changes in hourly wages, and gains of hours relative to the gains of employment. And that's not a bad thing, but you need to ask yourself, under what conditions will employers make the decision to emphasize increasing the hours worked in their workforces as opposed to adding new workers or raising wages generally? And I would suggest that there are two circumstances. One is that they find that new workers are getting a little hard to find, and the ones they think would be desirable can only be induced into the labor force by raising wages generally, which is a costly and irreversible process which they would rather avoid. And the other, equally or perhaps more likely, and I think perhaps the key to this situation, is that they are acting in a way consistent with the belief that they don't expect things to continue along these lines for very much longer, because it's much easier to cut back people's hours than it is either to lay them off or to certainly to impose a reduction in the rate of wages. So while this is good news, it clearly reflects an increased flow of incomes to a large spectrum of the population. It may also be news which is in anticipation of worse to come. And that is particularly true, as we can expect, that Mr. Fisher cannot be held at bay indefinitely, and after November 8th, one has to expect that the final boom will be lowered on the holdouts, the doves of the Federal Reserve. Having said that, I do not expect that those sharing our values or this analysis will be in position to design and implement a policy program anytime soon. But one can, and I will close by simply sketching out what the positive priorities would be if that were possible. It seems to me clearly must include energy transformation and conservation. It must include a demilitarization and a serious effort to achieve climate of peace and stability in the larger world, which includes in our relationships with the other major powers, with whom we are engaged in dangerous games at the moment. It must include the creation of jobs that cannot be outsourced or automated, jobs that meet actual social needs. It must include the public investments that we require, and if possible, a new and stable financial system, in part public, and otherwise decentralized, well-regulated, and subject to public interest. Above all, we need to reconfirm our confidence and belief in the necessity of effective social insurance programs that protect the vulnerable in difficult times, recognizing that if the overall rate of growth is slower, then there are going to be more people who are in need of that sort of protection. And enough in the financial balance of the public sector to supply private enterprise with a modest capacity to earn profits, and preferably widely distributed among smaller entities over many decentralized firms in the services sector and in ways which support the objective of maintaining a high level of employment. Where the private sector produces large accumulations, as it will from time to time, then it seems to me it is part of the function of the tax system to bring those back into circulation in the nonprofit sector at the earliest date by frightening the accumulators with the prospect of what may happen when the Grim Reaper and the tax collector come at the same time. And so also to block the formation of family dynasties and to limit the reach of political power that is rooted in finance, in technology, and in land, a concentration of political power which is at the source of our difficulties, the foundation of our difficulty of getting anything done in the first place. Thanks very much.
Jamie, in terms of the financial sector, the last 25, 30 years we've had a lot of deregulation of financial markets. Are you suggesting, A, that we have to reinstall certain kinds of regulations, and if so, some sort of form of a 21st century Glass-Steagall Act?
Yeah, I think there's a great deal that needs to be done in the financial sector. The structure of the institutions that we have now is they're far too large. They concentrate political and administrative power in the hands of a very small number of people, and they are prone to every form of internal institutional dysfunction, of which the intermingling of commercial investment and commercial banking is part of it. But the mantra of a 21st century Glass-Steagall does not strike me as being remotely sufficient to this problem, because in an earlier period, when you had smaller institutions and they were based in different and diverse regional and other kinds of communities, they did different things, and so they balanced out, if you like. There was a certain evening out of the pattern of development and the pattern of economic risk. If you simply go back to having 500 or 1,000 smaller banks, and they're all linked together by the same information nets and playing in the same financial markets, it's not obvious to me that you've gained anything unless you've got specific regulatory control over what those institutions are actually doing. And so the problem strikes me as being a bit more problematic now as a result of the integration of financial markets at the national and global scale and the development of the technologies that we have than it would have been 70 or 80 years ago. And that's the issue that I find troublesome.
Let me add just one question. What about what about the necessity of capital flow?
I'm sorry, you need a microphone a second.
On the international section, do you see the need for international capital flow controls?
I had the experience of working within a framework of capital controls in Greece, beginning at the end of June in 2015. I have to say that ultimately that may be what you need to do. And it's maybe what will happen, first of all, in the continuing unfolding of the European crisis, that more countries will be placed under capital controls, which has the effect, obviously, of greatly restricting the economic liberties of the lower sector of the population. Obviously, a great many businesses and so forth manage this by moving their working capital in part out of the country, and so they manage to deal with the consequences of capital controls. But it does have a significant cost for ordinary households who don't have that option. So that's it. But it may, at the end of the day, be what will be forced on a large part of the world, beginning with increasing strata in Europe as a result of the unsustainability of the present system.
And inversion.
Say again?
Inversion.
Inversions.
Inversion. Terms inverting with.
One form of capital controls is to prevent inversions, and I think both Hillary and Trump are for some form of preventing further inversions.
Yeah.
Do you go for that as well?
I would need to talk to a tax lawyer to see exactly how far and effective these measures are. Yes, this is a popular theme. Do you believe that we have an effective answer to the inversion problem?
I think it's the problem, but it's how it's solved. Right.
Yeah. Okay. We'll agree.
Thank you. So we had a statement and a question. The statement is I've been recommending The End of Normal to my colleagues as one of the best books on ecological economics in recent times because it takes these long-standing issues raised in ecological economics and gives them some coherency in the macroeconomic realm. Question, so what you're alluding to or mentioned about the demands from mitigating climate change, after Paris, some studies have come out showing that nearly all of the remaining fossil reserves have to stay in the ground, which is not only very difficult technologically and in terms of macroeconomic dynamics, but it's also raising severe questions about equity between high-income and developing countries. For example, Indonesia, what does it do with its coal? Do you have, I realize this is springing a lot, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Beyond the fact that you're right that we need to come to grips with the scale of this challenge, and we need to do it pretty quickly. My own sense is that part of what has to happen is that people who have dedicated knowledge need to be brought into this discussion. One of the things that I think we are doing that we can be reproached for doing as economists is hogging the stage. That chapter at the End of Normal was really based on joint work with a very good physicist and someone who has spent a lot more time on these issues than I ever have and who's gotten a lot less credit for it. And I think that is something that we all ought to be quite conscious of. I have a hard time, I like the microphone as much as anybody, but the reality is we're not opening our discussion as much as we should be to people who have the appropriate, who can speak with authority to the kind of question that you just raised.
I'm wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on why the private profit rate has declined, the measured profit rate. You know, because from what I got from your remarks, and I'm excuse me if other people are have got this point better than I have, but if the price of capital goods declines, and investment opportunities are declining, let's say due to lack of demand or whatever, it's not clear exactly why there should be a decline in the measured profit rate, and that seemed to be a key point.
Because the cash volume of investment falls, right? And in terms of what you have to lay out in cash terms, which is what goes into the national income accounts, it's less. And to the extent that you are importing your machinery, because it's in the nature of this sort of thing, anyway, that it's also going to be deducted from GDP as an import rather than as an increment to domestic demand. So for those two reasons, you have a lower investment share. With a lower investment share, you have less in the way of total demand and therefore total profitability. That's the line of argument that I would make. Okay, is that yep.
Thank you.
I mean, it's clear that the private investment share has fallen, right? That I think is well established, and that's one of the reasons why the growth rate was slower in this expansion than it has been in the past. Well, why is that? Well, it certainly has something to do with the character of what is being bought as investment goods. Less in the way of fixed facilities, more in the way of imported equipment at relatively low prices.
That's less volume. I'm just wondering that you had a profit rate rationale in there as well, which is what I didn't quite follow.
Well, the profit rate's a ratio to the capital stock, so I'm simply thinking about the rate of growth, the volume of expenditure on investment, and therefore the general profitability of the economy.
What do you think of the idea of having money tethered to a service of nature like benign renewable energy, so we can have a decentralized banking system appropriate for each bioregion of the planet, so we can connect the environment, the financial system to the real world, which sustains life on the planet?
I haven't thought about it, so I can't really comment, but I have a certain skepticism about institutional design solutions to this issue. It seems to me that one has to focus on achieving the objective, which is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the non-using of fossil fuels. I would be surprised if there was a simple institutional way to make that happen, as it were, through a market mechanism. This was an issue that came up at the start of the World War II. Keynes' position was that you could, if you regulated the overall flow of demand, you could leave a great deal to the marketplace. And when my father took over the Office of Price Administration, realized that you had to be much more, let's say, direct about how you intervened on these matters, and you simply put a lid on everybody's prices unless he personally approved the increase, which he's generally not inclined to do. And so I guess it's a Galbraithian tradition to believe that sometimes the exercise of power is actually essential in these matters when you're facing an emergency.
Yeah, Jimmy, just real quick. You mentioned about, you and Amr also spoke yesterday, almost like you speak with the workers, almost like if they're passive, or like a passive agent, passive elements in this, and then we accept the hours, the long hours. We have other elements of the reserve army coming in, et cetera. And I'm not saying that's not true, but I'm saying what would be the ideal strategy if workers were to have more of an active voice? What would be the ideal strategy to deal with? I mean, we always talk the labor here like as if it's just a factor and it's just passive. What would be if we could have it? I think that collective bargaining is going to be an issue. I think industrial unionism has to be important, so we don't have it in the United States. I mean, what do you think would be the way? I'm not that we can even get it, but how could we get to having some agency into the labor?
It's a valid observation. I do think that these decisions are being taken largely by employers. And it's important to recognize that that's where the power is, and they are making choices based upon their perception of the future. That strikes me as being, that's why I phrased it that way. Well, what could be done? There, of course, one can regulate hours, one can regulate and extend the overtime, making it costlier to add hours as opposed to adding staff. That will encourage an extension of employment, if that's what you want to do. That strikes me as a reasonable objective. The most important thing, however, immediately on the agenda is something that I've been advocating for many years now, which is a very large increase in the minimum wage. Because that would then have a significant effect on the whole structure of earnings in the American workforce, and have a significant effect on the purchasing power at the lower end of the spectrum. So that strikes me as a legislative act which is already in process politically in a great many communities and states in this country, and it could be extended and should be extended to the federal level, and one which has the nice feature that it has a fair amount of conservative support, partly because it does not have budget implications per se, and partly because it can be, I think, effectively argued that this is would be a major benefit to documented as opposed to undocumented workers, which is a very desirable step.
And just to follow up real quick, the earlier one about the regulation of the hours, where do you think that could go, and how could that be a potential? I mean, I think that the ending of mandatory overtime is essential from a working class point of view. We shouldn't be forced to do overtime, and that's yet part of the regular schedule. People are scheduled to do double shifts. If they don't, then they don't keep their job. So the question is like, I mean, the wage is an important element, but you mentioned earlier the hours, and it's almost like that's not given a lot of attention generally.
I think that's a very useful issue to bring up and to raise as well. Sure.
First, I want to thank you for making heterogenic the latest edition of my vocabulary. But is it really though? I mean, or is it our central bank in collusion with offshore banks to orchestrate financial oppression or an orderly 16-year deleveraging, as you put it, and I agree, because of the anticipation or acknowledgement that we are running out of known reserves of oil, and they're preparing for that at the expense of the bottom half of our population.
Come again on the question. I'm not sure I understood it.
Is it really heterogenic, or is this on purpose that the Fed doesn't have to pay interest out because other banks are colluding with us?
Yeah, what I meant by that was that I think what Stan Fisher is doing, and Janet Yellen is doing, is they are increasing anxiety about what's going to happen next. And that is naturally going to cause people to fly to quality. Now that's going to have an effect, among other things, on the exchange rate of the dollar, and therefore on the competitive position of the American industry. It's going to have an adverse effect, is having a drastically adverse effect on the performance of the economies of many countries around the world. So your question is that incidental or is it deliberate? Well, that's a question that gets into motives which are not declared publicly. Since they're not declared publicly, I'm no more expert on that than you are.
I have two questions. I did not understand why the shift to environmentally more tolerable production would not be an important source of increasing demand. On the one hand, you are having increasing capital output ratio if you are privileging certain procedures of production. And the other way, I think, you have a lot of new investment with industry which you need for producing, for example, cleaner energy, or also the infrastructure, for example, for bringing clean energy, electricity to places where it's consumed. My second question is, I think, if you are looking into increasing mass consumption, you have to see that at least in some parts of the world, perhaps not in the United States, the degree of being threatened is so much that you have relatively high saving rates. I think do we not have to change also the general mood, the perception of the power relations in the society in order to come back to a basically Keynesian models where households consume what they get and where they do not try to save because that is really lost.
Well, on the first question, you're right that if you greatly ramp up the investment in alternative energies, for example, you're going to increase demand, potentially. But this is the situation that you faced at the outset of World War II, in which you have incomes running way ahead of the actual growth in the supply of consumable goods. If you attempt to meet that demand by importing it, well, you can do that, but you're going to defeat your environmental objective because the country supplying you have to power their production processes somehow. So you have to regulate the flow of spending in relation to the flow of incomes. That becomes effectively the problem. Now that means, in effect, that living standards are going to be lower than they would be if you took the cheapest supplies of energy. I mean, superficially, the living standards in material terms are reduced relative to what they would be if you take the cheapest supply of energy and let everything run in an uncontrolled fashion. That's clear. As to the second question, which is about household saving behavior, I think that the issue that, as I see it, is that we fueled the growth of demand by essentially household debt, and it is entirely understandable that that becomes unsustainable. Households neither can nor are willing to continue on a pattern of behavior, and so you end up with a change in their balances, which is driven by the desire to get out of the leverage that they're in. I take that as a datum. I don't see how that can be avoided, and as long as that adjustment is underway.
I said that the United States is very particular, but the United States is not a normal country.
I'm sorry, without a microphone, I can't hear you.
I was saying the United States to this point is a special case, and other societies are different now. But overall, the question of the Keynesian relaunch is a worldwide problem.
Is a what problem?
A worldwide problem. It's not only the United States. Worldwide.
I understand you, but okay, we'd have to pursue what you mean by that.
Okay, so I wanted to come back to what Scott was talking about. Last year we had Richard Wolff here, famous Marxist, but what was interesting about what he's up to is he's working with a bunch of legal scholars and other activists to help workers take over factories in places like Detroit. And the main obstacle has been financing and legal structures in order to get into this. And I was thinking that maybe Post-Keynesian should spend some more time pursuing this line of work because you have the worker earning a wage, but they're also setting the management structures and making these decisions that you've been talking about. And I wondered if you had advocated for any of those kinds of policies.
I'll leave that to Richard, who knows more about it than I do. It's, I think, a pattern in the turning over of factories to workers that they tend to get them when they're in trouble and not when they're intrinsically profitable. So this becomes a way to keep jobs and activity going in the face of a tough situation. And as a result, the success rate is not and shouldn't be expected to be very high. So I think there may be a place for this, but as a way to maintain the overall level of employment compared to the number of people who are going to need jobs, it's got to be a very small part of the relatively small part of the problem that we face. We have a much bigger job of essentially creating institutions which can deliver the scale job opportunities that we need to deliver, and deliver them in a way that's useful and sustainable.
Thank you very much for the talk. Just a question about where you started with the neutral rate of interest. It seems like in recent weeks and months, the various other lines of defense for central bank orthodoxy around the Wickselian view have sort of dissolved, and the neutral rate, which from my perspective feels like it's at the beating heart of that theory, seems to have now come to the fore as the last sort of line of defense. I'm curious if you think, with the broadsides that various members of the sort of orthodox or the central banking class are launching around at the moment to each other, is there any opening? Is there any sort of space for another coherent narrative, or do you think that the natural rate theory is sufficiently non-falsifiable that it'll be a strong line of defense?
You're pointing to something which is, I think, a very useful observation, and something I've observed over many, many years, which is that when you pierce one bit of central bank nonsense, there's always another one behind it. And this has been going on since the days of when the monetarists were riding high on their rate of growth of whichever version of the money stock they happen to feel most convenient at any particular moment. And so then we move from there to interest rate targeting, and from there to inflation targeting, and now we have something, and one of the things I tried to bring out was that the notion of the natural rate and the notion of the neutral rate are rooted in two entirely different intellectual traditions, but no very clear effort is being made to distinguish them in this. I hesitate to call it literature, which is an economist term for a great deal of unreadable dreck. But yes, what you are seeing from a political economy or political analysis point of view is a body of propaganda work, and it is a great sport to puncture through the layers, but you should never expect that you're going to arrive at the final one, and you're going to get behind the curtain, and there will be the Wizard of Oz, and he will admit to you that he's a fraud. The Wizard of Oz has got a curtain factory, which is goes faster than you can peel it back. And again, the good thing about this is you can make an entire career, as I did for many years, out of this, and it's pretty good sport as well. And central bankers are sensitive souls, and when you get under their skin, they really do get annoyed, and so that's also another source of pleasure in the world.
Shifting the conversation a little bit, Jamie over here, shifting the conversation a little bit to the local state level, while many of our progressive friends are trying to focus the conversation on the presidential elections and Trump or Clinton, the Koch brothers and everybody else is making sure that at the state level, they've got everything under control, and they're actually, gaining even more terrain as we speak. And this is where, we're talking about public policy. A lot of it is done at the local level. So how do we shift the narrative away from everything that's consuming the media conversation now about, the federal level macroeconomic policy, public policy, to where it matters to most people, where at the state level they're saying tax revenues are falling, we need to cut things left and right, and that's where the most vulnerable population suffers the consequences of what we're living today. So how would you go about shifting the narrative, the conversation to the local level?
It's a hugely important question. What the Koch brothers and their allies have done by concentrating on the control of state legislatures and governors' offices is that have used that not only as a bench to produce an endless supply of potential legislators and executives and so forth, but also for the control of the gerrymandering process in the House of Representatives, which has given them a completely largely illegitimate enduring grip on that institution. So it extends from the local to the federal level in very direct ways. What has to happen here is an organizing effort at the local level to restore a competitive and political environment at the very local level, and then moving up to the state legislatures and on from there. And that is something which there needs to be an active pushback against the obsessive year-on-year emphasis on who is going to win the presidential race. And I think, given the way the Sanders campaign turned out, the organization, resources, and energy that went into that campaign should be invested now in a decentralized but national effort to try and beat back this essentially oligarchic control at the local level. It's a very important point. Thank you for raising it.
All right, let's take that.